right, so we're going to be starting with Mice and Men, classic novel by John Steinbeck. He also wrote The Grapes of Wrath, much longer novel, follows the same theme of migrant workers. So in your PowerPoint on the Great Depression, that should have given you some context into the Great Depression and migrant workers. Migrant worker, if you didn't look it up, is just someone who travels away from their homeland in search of work. Usually, migrant worker means someone who's traveling within their country of birth, as opposed to an immigrant worker who would be someone from another country coming to the US, for example, to work. So a migrant worker is someone from America traveling throughout America looking for work, which was very popular during the Great Depression because there was no work anywhere. So, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, please make sure that you also have your, chapter 1, that was the wrong class, chapter 1 discussion questions open. And, all right, let's get going. Okay, this was first published in 1937, so Great Depression was roughly late 20s through the 30s, so this was published pretty much in the heart of it. That's a mouse. It kind of looks like a cat or a dog, but it's a mouse. Okay. A few miles south of Soledad is in California, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm, too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees. Willows, fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding. And sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, like raccoons, and with the spread pad of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is also a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come wearily down from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore, there is an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by men who have sat on it. So question 1 is asking, how does the imagery on the first and second page, which is technically what we just read, how does the imagery affect the mood of the reader? So we have the imagery of being in the foothills of a mountain range. There's a nice, quiet river and some nice yellow sandy beaches to sit on. You have the imagery of a lizard running through the dried up leaves. You have raccoons, rabbits, deer, dogs. You have people that come and swim in the pool. Tramps, meaning prostitutes, coming down to, do what prostitutes do near the water. So what is the imagery that these first couple paragraphs give you? How are you feeling after reading this? And that's your answer to number 1. So it should be a feeling of like peace, serenity, calmness, because people just go down and sit along the beaches of this river to kind of relax and have a good time. On the evening of a hot day started the little wind to moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills toward the top. On the sandbanks, the rabbits sat as quietly as little gray sculptured stones. And then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noisily for cover. A stilted heron labored up in the air and pounded down the river. For a moment, the place was lifeless. And then 2 men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. They had walked in single file down the path, and even in the open, one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. The first man was small and quick, dark of face with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined. Small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. So when it says that the smaller man is dark of face, it means that he's very tan. So what you have to picture is probably an average size man by today's standards, probably between 5'6" and 5'8", slender. And then the other man that comes behind him is apparently big, huge guy. So next to the 5'6" man, he's probably, 6'2"-ish, hulking. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat bead with his forefinger and snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool. Drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. "Lenny!" he said sharply. "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much!" Lenny continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lenny, you're gonna be sick like you was last night!" Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then when he sat up on the bank and his hat dripped down on his blue coat and ran down his back. "That's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." He smiled happily. So the big guy's name is Lenny, smaller man's name George. So on pages, the page numbers are off. The page numbers come from the hard copy book. But we can start to do Lenny's description. So how would you characterize Lenny? So far, we know that he's big, huge, shapeless of face, large, pale eyes. So he's got blue eyes and wide, sloping shoulders. He walks heavily, dragging his feet a little. So you can get all that down. There's going to be a little bit more about him. George unslung his bindle, so the bindle is like the blanket roll, and dropped it gently on the bank. "I ain't sure it's good water," he said. "It looks kind of scummy." So, I'm just looking at the next question. Lenny dabbled his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. "Look, George, look what I done." So the part about calling his hands paws, that's interesting. Not his big hand, his big paw. So you might want to write down that Lenny is described as having like animal qualities in the way he moves. Sorry, of course it just scrolled down way too far. Oh, goodness. Thank you, technology. We're back on track. Lenny dabbled his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers, blah, 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 blah. "Look, George, look what I done." George knelt beside the pool and drank from his hand with quick scoops. "It tastes all right," he admitted. "Don't really seem to be running, though. You never ought to drink water that ain't running, Lenny," he said hopelessly. "You'd drink out of a gutter if you was thirsty." He threw a scoop of water into his face and rubbed it about with his hand, under his chin, around the back of his neck. Then he replaced his hat and pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees and embraced them. Lenny, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had done it just right. He pulled his hat down a little over his eyes, the way George's hat was. George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. He said angrily, "We could just as well have rode clear to the ranch if that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about. Just a little stretch down the highway," he says. "Just a little stretch. Goddamn near 4 miles, that's what it was. Didn't want to stop at the ranch gate, that's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wonder he isn't too damn good to stop in Soledad at all. Kicks us out and says, 'Just a little stretch down the road.' I bet it was more than 4 miles. Damn hot day." So they are in California, in like the south of California. So it's hot, sort of desert-like, and what it hasn't told you yet is that Lenny and George, they're migrant workers, and they're traveling to a ranch. And they took a bus to get there, but the bus driver dropped them off way too early, so they've had to walk like the last stretch of the journey, and they're taking a break. Lenny looked timidly over to him. George? Well, what do you want? Where are we going, George? The little man jerked down the brim of his hat and scowled over at Lenny. So, you forgot already, did you? I gotta tell you again, do I? Jesus Christ, you crazy bastard. I forgot, Lenny said softly. I tried not to forget. Honest to God, I did, George. Okay, I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well spend all my time telling you things, and then you forget them, and I tell you again. I tried and tried, said Lenny, but it didn't do no good. I remember about the rabbits, George. Oh, the hell with the rabbits. That's all you ever can remember is them rabbits. Okay, now you listen, and this time you gotta remember so we don't get in no trouble. You remember sitting in that gutter on Howard Street and watching that blackboard? Lenny's face broke into a delighted smile. Why, sure, George. I remember that. But what do we do then? I remember some girls come by, and you says, oh, the hell with what I says. You remember about us going into Murray and Reddy's, and they gave us work cards and bus tickets? Oh, sure, George, I remember that now. His hands went quickly into his side coat pockets. He said gently, George, I ain't got mine. I must have lost it. He looked down at the ground in despair. You never had none, you crazy bastard. I got both of them here. Think I let you carry your own work card? So Murray and Reddy's was like if you think of like a temp agency now, it's a place where you go to find places that are hiring. So George went in to find a place, a ranch, where he and Lenny could go work, and they gave George the work cards because when you got to the ranch, you had to present the owner with these work cards saying that, you're a good person, you have a good background check, and that you're legal to work. Okay. He doesn't allow Lenny to keep his because he says Lenny would just lose it. Lenny grinned with relief. Oh, I thought I put it in my side pocket. His hand went into the pocket again. George looked sharply at him. What'd you take out of that pocket? Oh, you ain't got a thing in my pocket, Lenny said cleverly. I know there ain't. You got it in your hand. What you got in your hand? You hiding it? I ain't got nothing, George. Honest. Come on, give it here. Lenny held his closed hand away from George's direction. It's only a mouse, George. A mouse? A live mouse? Mm-hmm. Just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it. Honest, I found it. I found it dead. Oh, give it here, said George. Oh, leave me have it, George. Give it here. Lenny's closed hand slowly obeyed. George took the mouse and threw it across the pool to the other side among the brush. What do you want of a dead mouse, anyways? Well, I could pet it with my thumb while we was walking along, said Lenny. Well, you ain't petting no mouse while you walk with me. You remember where we're going now? So pause for a second and come over to the discussion questions. Lenny, so he's huge guy, walks slow, described as being animal-like. And if you haven't picked up from the dialogue yet, he does have a mental handicap. What that handicap is, we don't know, because this was written in the 30s. And if you remember anything from our ableism unit, people that were born with any sort of mental handicap, they were just put in a group home or in an asylum because they were seen as being no good to society. So how Lenny has escaped being put in a group home, who knows? He's not super severely mentally handicapped, but he's severe enough that he can't live alone and he can't be alone. He wouldn't be able to take care of himself. So you can add that to number 2. And then what do you think the purpose is in Steinbeck including the detail about Lenny's dead mouse? He says that it's dead and he found it dead and he just wants to be able to pet it as they go along. So Lenny, I'll explain quickly. Lenny likes soft, pretty things and they calm him. That's his calming mechanism. So you can write that down for number 3 and then open up the next video and we'll keep going.